Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. I am Pastor Joshua Sullivan here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. Today we're diving into the Old Testament. Someone asks, Dear Pastor, I've seen critics use Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29, as a way of arguing against the Bible's respect toward human dignity. Critics say that this passage essentially forces a traumatized woman into living with her rapist for the rest of her life and trying to discredit God's goodness. I have not been asked this personally, but I've seen and heard, usually on online forums, but the answer that I get in my head as of recent is this: that the law describes the penalty for the perpetrator, specifically, and along with what I'm assuming to be a large sum of money in that time to be paid to the family, the law indebts him for life to the woman he raped, as well as maintaining the honor and integrity of her family, who was also wronged by this crime. That's the best that I can think of, but I don't feel like it's totally effective. And if I were to be faced with this question and I used that answer, I feel like I would likely be berated with more hostile, righteous atheist interrogation, with no honest answer to the questions. Have you had this criticism face to face, and what have you learned in your studies? So I think the first thing that we have to say right off the bat is this legislation can't be read as if it were written in modern America. Ancient Near Eastern culture is vastly different from contemporary Western culture. It valued different things than our culture today values them. And so when people today use this passage or others like it to try to discredit God's goodness or the Bible's respect for human dignity, like you point out, they think they're comparing apples to apples, when in reality, that's not the case. The differences between our culture and ancient Israelite culture, I think, become apparent once we read the text. So Moses writes in Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29, If a man finds a young woman who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall give to the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife because he has humbled her. He shall not be permitted to divorce her all his days. So this law does two things. First, it punishes the rapist, but it also then protects the woman from a life of destitution because of this heinous act. So let's explore this. Let's unpack this. The law punishes the rapist, as you point out, by demanding two things from him. So first, he has to pay 50 shekels to the victim's father. Now, he's not buying his victim here. He's paying the bride price for her. This was the common bride price in Israel. When a young man wanted to marry a young woman, he approached the young woman's father and he gave her this bride price. And this custom existed in other ancient Near Eastern cultures as well, not just ancient Israel. Now, that's the first thing the law exacts from him. The second thing, then, that it demands of him is that, like you said, it demands that he marry the woman. Now, in both of these, with both of these punishments, the law is basically saying to this guy, you want to be one flesh with this woman? Then you can only do that through marriage. So you pay the bride price, and you marry her, and you take her as your wife until the day that you die. This makes this law rooted in the scriptural idea that the sexual union between a man and a woman makes them into one flesh, what we see in Genesis chapter 2. And it also shows us, I think even more importantly then, that God's will for the sexual union is that it take place only within the bounds of marriage. Since the man has become one flesh with this woman, then he must marry her. What God is teaching the ancient Israelites in this is to value and to esteem the one flesh union of marriage above all other considerations. Now, as you mentioned, critics, we'll just call them feminists here, will cry that this law essentially forces a traumatized woman to live with a rapist for the rest of her life. But again, to view it like that is to take things from the modern standpoint. In our day and age, when a woman is raped, for as heinous and as terrible and sinful as that is, that doesn't preclude her from being married in the future. Nor does it mean that she's going to be financially destitute for the rest of her life. But that wasn't the case in ancient Israel, not by a long shot. Women in the ancient Near East were dependent financially upon their husbands. And so if no one would marry this woman then, once her father dies, she would be destitute. She would be broke for the rest of her life then. By marrying this woman, this man is legally bound to provide for her, but also legally bound to provide for any children which may have come from this union. Again, for the rest of his life. That provision's guaranteed because he can never divorce the woman. Now, this essentially protects the woman financially for the rest of her life. Again, at this point, feminists will throw up their arms and prattle on about the woman's happiness. But at that point, we're dealing with something that no law can legislate. The law can't legislate happiness. That's not what the law does. That's not what any law can do. The law is rather intended to punish the evildoer and to protect the victim then from a life of destitution and poverty because of someone else's sin. Now, it may not be the ideal situation, but again, laws like this don't exist to deal with ideal situations. And I think when we view it within this context, the law does show God's goodness in that he won't allow one man's heinous sin to destroy a woman for the rest of her life. Through this legislation, the Lord provides for her and protects her for the rest of this man's life. Now, looking at this text, it should also be noted that this law isn't absolute, meaning that this woman is not compelled to marry the man who's humbled her in every single case. This very same legislation was first given in the 22nd chapter of Exodus. So if we go to Exodus 22, verses 16 and 17, there Moses writes, "If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins." Now, there in Exodus 22, the key phrase is, if her father utterly refuses to give her to him. So based on the Exodus passage of this very same legislation, it's clear that the law isn't absolute. The woman does not absolutely have to marry this man in every case. Like every other arranged marriage in ancient Israel, or in the ancient world for that matter, the father has the ultimate say. Now, that also then does not mean that fathers just indiscriminately married off their daughters without asking them or consulting them their opinions and feelings. We have a great example in the scripture. In Genesis chapter 24, we're given the example of Rebekah's engagement or betrothal to Isaac. And there, Rebekah's father specifically asks her in Genesis 24, verse 58, "Will you go with this man?" And she says, "I will go." So if a father thinks that marriage between this man and this woman is the best way to deal with a bad situation, then that marriage happens. But if he refuses to give his daughter to this man, he still gets the 50 shekels as a bride price. Not for his own enrichment, but that bride price would then be used to provide for his daughter after he passed away then. Ultimately, like we said before, this law shouldn't be read as if it were written for us today, because it wasn't. It was promulgated for God's covenant people, for the Old Testament Israelites, and was, like many laws in Moses, designed to deal with less than ideal situations. Ultimately, to punish the evildoer, but also to protect the victim from a terrible life of destitution because of someone else's heinous sin against them. Now, while this law doesn't apply to Christians, because Christians aren't under Mosaic law, it is still the divinely inspired Word of God. St. Paul writes in 2 Timothy 3:16 that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. This means that even though this law doesn't apply to us Christians, the Lord still teaches us His will through the text. Well, what does He teach us in this text? I think He teaches us three things. First, I think He demonstrates that rape is contrary to His will, that rape is sinful. Second, it shows God's concern for those who have been victimized by this heinous sin. But third, and finally, I think it teaches us that the Lord's will for the sexual union between man and woman is something that is to be vigorously protected, defended, and kept within the bounds of marriage as He intended it from the beginning then. That's Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29. Thank you for watching ATP. Thank you for the question. Make sure that you peruse past ATP videos, and if you're interested in more topics like this one, make sure and check out the playlist that we recently made entitled Old Testament Passages. If you liked this video, then there may be some things on there that you find interesting as well. Thanks for watching Ask the Pastor. We'll see you next time.